Mohamed, it's very, very interesting to see a sitting governor of an emerging market central bank write publicly that there is a risk of a crisis. Does the Fed have a role to play here, and why so much attention now on the Fed's balance sheet?
So the attention on the Fed balance sheet simply is because it's shrinking and it's going to continue to shrink. And that's happening at the same time as the deficit is getting larger. Typically, there are two countries, two emerging economies that usually speak out, India and Brazil, and you're hearing from India. And they're basically telling you that the global liquidity tide is going out, and when that happens, it accentuates individual countries' vulnerabilities. So they're just warning, it is not going to change the Fed's behavior. The Fed is guided mostly by US factors, and it would take a massive global crisis to change the Fed's behavior. So I understand what they're saying, and it's consistent with what they've been saying before, but it's not going to change the Fed reaction function. It's going to depend on their own self-insurance. And that's where different emerging economies are going to be differentiated in the period ahead.
And this is why, Mohamed, as you've pointed out so many times, policy error is so important. I think the Fed might look at this situation and say, why should we clean up your mess? There's quite clearly been some policy errors in Turkey, Argentina and Brazil over the last couple of months. Will that be something the Fed asks as well? And just how much room for error is there now in emerging markets, considering the policy consequences from those errors we've seen over the last month or so, Mohamed?
There's a lot less room for policy error, and it's really tricky. I would hate to be the central banker in Brazil today, because on the one hand, you want to intervene, you want to put in liquidity. On the other hand, you may end up in a catch-22 situation that the more liquidity you put in, the more people exit. This is a very hard policy situation. You've got to be able to judge and touch the technicals of your markets. You've got to understand the investor base. So the scope for policy error, unfortunately, is considerable. And my great hope is that these countries will be able to navigate. All they need to do is get through this technical dislocation and then rely on their fundamentals.